Hey everybody, welcome to day 4, the tools of high magic. Today, blades, right? All the ritual swords, all the sharp, shiny objects that we get to go through and the uses in magic. Now, there are certain traditions that I will not talk about, and it will be things in like the ATR and what they do with theirs. So that's not for this conversation. We're specifically focusing on the applications of ritual blades, the spirit within them, and what they can conjure for you or protect you for, right? So there is a saying in one of the books that I was reading years ago that woe to the magician that can't make a dagger function the same way as a ritual sword in his protection. The reason being that that quote has stuck with me is because there is a thing with swords where the spirit of the sword wants to be used, where it seeks use in certain ways. And so under certain conditions, the swords become animated because of the lives that they're directly related to taking, because it is a weapon of war. So it's a weapon of defense. And so standing it straight up and down in a ritual circle, stabbing it into the ground, purifying the land around it, essentially, declares to the enemy or the spirits that would attack the circle that this is not a space for you, right? In the Simon Necronomicon, they say using a sword and blessing the spirit of the sword as the tool of the watcher, right, that watches the circle and protects against enemies. You can do something like that with any weapon, with anything with a blade on it, especially if it's been blooded. What do I mean by blooded? It either bit you by cutting you or somebody else, or you're using it for ritual sacrifice, or it has come through a violent means. What do I mean by violent means? I mean, it's either been used in war, it's been used in a crime, it's been used in hurting or afflicting others. And those have a very specific resonance to them, which aren't conducive to most magics in the West. You want to have something that's the flaming sword of the angel Raziel, right? Which he uses to protect the Garden of Eden against the enemies, or against re-entry from Adam and Eve and anybody else, right? So your sword, depending on how you bless it, depending on what you do with it, becomes that different type of weapon. And in Feng Shui, Taoist magic, and Eastern traditions, there is the sword of the Big Dipper. On one side, a dragon, on the other is the postnatal hexagrams of the I Ching and the star constellation of the Big Dipper. So with this, you can trace out the various patterns and sigils in the exact same manner as a wand. And as you cut it into space, you thrust your energy out, it ripples forward, and you have that effect of a ritual bit of magic in the same way as a wand. So using Taoist magic and one of the razor sharp swords, training swords and just general Tai Chi swords, right, allows you to practice with that energy. Cold steel makes a really fantastic one that is actually razor sharp. That would be a beautiful thing to practice with. But at the same time, it's also a tool of war. It's an implement of not necessarily that you're going to be the most passive individual ever. Now, in traditional witchcraft and ceremonial magic, you have the cross sword, right? This particular one is a damask blade, and it's got the many layer folds into it. The reason I use one of these is very simply because every ripple is a reality. And so if I need to shave between different spaces and cut the circle between different energies, then I've got all the different ripples that this is connecting into, right? And how do they make that? They just fold many different layers of steel and they don't polish it off. It actually shows the ripples the way that they make it. This one has a camel horn handle and it's got the sigil cut into it with a wood burner. So that way it attaches the name of the spirit and the application of that spirit as a binding or a bonding. At the bottom down here, you can attach talismans. You can attach, in Chinese magic, they use the ribbon with the 2 tassels so that the energy can flow off back into the yin or the yang flows as it stabilizes. So with that, the more you use your sword, the easier it is to have it get a name, right? The less mass produced it is, hand forged blades and things like that, the more interesting it becomes in the same kind of way that this is a ritual tool that I use for cutting paper and parchments. It's a hand forged blade from Japan. The family that imports these knows the bladesmith for this. Like, they're very particular about the kind of materials and steels that they use. And this one, like the wand, earned a name. And so that's one of those things that you keep on hand for a variety of reasons. But that one is generally used just for paper and skins to be able to cut them down accordingly, nice and razor sharp. Then you have ones like this, where you have the fantasy shapes, right? This one does have a razor sharp, sword down, razor sharp blade on it. It does have the teeth here for the cutting, but these holes inside of it, I'll hold that up, can hold talismans or stones. And so what I'll do is I'll write out the talisman that I'm using, roll it up and stick it in here, and then the blade becomes part of the spell. So that way I can use it in a 4-dimensional, there's a pin that would come through here. And so as I move it out and around, it's connecting to multiple planes at the same time. So it's not just the left path or the right path, it's the up and down as well, right? And then you've got things like the Furba, which I'd actually have to get up to go get. It's got Brahma on the back, or Ganesh on the back end, and the 4-fold dagger on the front, and that's used for exorcism, right? Channeling Ganesh as the son of Brahma into the lightning blade to exorcise evil. And Ganesh in the Hindu mythologies is the child of both human and divine. So it, in like us, are the union between the worlds, between that which is divine and that which is physical. So that using that, blessing that by Ganesh, exorcising evil with it, works out really good. Otherwise, there's the different materials that you can use. So this is one of the oldest in my personal collection that I've had. This was the first ritual blade that I've ever had. It took me almost a year to pay it off. It's made out of brass, it's made out of nickel, stainless steel, copper, and ebony. So in the handle is the copper and the ebony, along with the brass. There is the nickel, the copper, and again, the brass. Everything onto this, when it comes to the design of both the sheath and the blade, is made in the traditional Tuareg way. It was made by one of their tribesmen and brought over to the United States, and was collected by one of the traders that I learned grid magic from, stone magic, up in Northern California. So this was a special piece. They had 2 of them available, and I purchased one. They had a really bunch of great, like, bone malas, like made out of the human bone. They had the conch shell that had the engravings and such on it, and really beautiful original pieces that come up out of Asia. And this one is from Northern Africa, so part of the Tuareg tribe. Ceremonial magic base is handmade, hand forged for ritual purposes. They would carry these for ceremonial purposes as well. So that one's got a lot of history to it. Second piece I'd say is your general working knife, right? Just standard Pakistani stainless steel with the brass ends on it, double-sided, can be used for cutting, can be used for plants, can be used for directing energy work. You can engrave into the blade if you want to. These things you get at most witch shops, or you can get these at like farmers markets, flea markets. Generally, this is what everybody has because these ones are mass produced. They don't really have the construction to do heavy cutting because it is a rat tail construction. So that means there's a thin piece of metal in here that connects to the blade itself. And it's not really conducive for anything more than just energy direction. Then you've got things that you can do in conditions that they function in a specific purpose. And this particular one is what I use for said specific purpose. So it's wrapped because of the energy that it deals in specifically, much like the dagger of Brahma, which the Furba is for exercising things. This is a crisp blade. I use it to cut and destroy spirits in this case. So if you notice, there is a repeating pattern. The same handles, different materials, brass, copper, right? This one, I got this back in the 90s, is one of the, actually, I would say this was my first real, like, hefty, good, solid dagger before the ritual blade that I got up in high school. But with this one, I use this in an exorcism. I'll hold it over the candle flame. As the blade gets heated by that fire, I'll make the conjurations, and with the ingredients that I've already put on the blade to condition it, activating those, therefore allowing me to trap spirits within it. Right. So instead of banishing them and sending them away like the Furba does, this one can be used as a containment. So keep it wrapped out of use. The less you touch the blade, the better with these. Care and maintenance on your carbon steel blades should be, your oils of your skin will cause it to rust. So never touch them. If you do touch them, polish them immediately, right? Use oil on it regularly. This is where most of those really good sword kits should come with the cleaning kits and such as well. Make sure that it's nice and sharp. Don't overdo it. And don't store blades in leather for long periods of time. So if you're not going to use it, they will corrode and rust in the same way that this one has already. So that's one of those, I've left this too long and need to clean it before I use it for ritual again. But this again is one of those pieces that I've had since high school. So this I've had for about 20 years, right? So then we get into what is the topic on everybody's to-do list, dealing with the spirits of war. And with the amount of conflict that exists on this planet, weapons that have seen combat are unfortunately not few and far between. The use of those is generally not conducive for good purposes. This is a bayonet from World War II. Argentine leather, fully battle ready, stains and such in the handle, and it's the serial numbers and such. Although they do not match, this has seen some shit. And it's full tank construction. And so what you would do with something like this, as it's been used for war, as it's been used for conflict, this is what you would use if you're going to go to war with spiritual adversaries, if you're going to use it in a capacity for bringing violence to them, right? So be aware of the spirits that are attached to weapons like this, or things that have been relieved from the dead on the battlefield, because their spirits and such can be attached to those. And so ways that you can do it, is a really fantastic video that Hayden put out in the Brotherhood the other day, where certain traditions you'd leave the axe in the door as a declaration of war, these First Nations. Or in this case, you can use the dagger and stab the shadow with it, right? And so therefore we get back into shadow magic, and there's an entire subsect of Taoist sorcery that deals with just working the shadows of somebody. Like, you can take your cane and you can stab or smack the shadow, and it'll affect the health of the individual. Same kind of thing can be happening with your blades. So you can take it and you can stab the shadow with it, or you can use it to pierce into the other world, or into their soul, or into their other states, depending on how you work the spell and depending on how it is that your blade is conditioned. So different ones will have different purposes and different properties. Using them in ritual magic is to define what that is going to look like for your space, what kind of energy you're looking to use in your space. Cheap materials that are plastics don't do well in ritual magic. If it's got fake plastic gemstones, if it's got glass beads in there, those are cute, but not effective, right? If you want something really ridiculous, you can find like the ones that are made out of antler horn that have uranium glass on it. And those ones, talk about glass that packs a punch. Whoo, damn. So you can use something like that. But you want to look for something that's handmade. You want to look for something that's not reproducible, because again, it functions as it's your regalia. It's part of what it is you get up to. So the less mass production of it, the more the spirit becomes alive, the more it becomes viable for use. And one of the things that you can do with it also is you can create talismans and script it down the blades. Like I've got this one, let's see if I can get it easy enough, that comes up out of Thailand. There it is. Forgot to mention this. So this little one comes out of Thailand. It's got the Sakyant on the blade. So it's already been inscribed by one of the Asians there. So if I can get you to see that.
Yep.
So to awaken this, I had to put it at where the Buddha stands staring at the ground, right? Lay this on the ground and awaken the blade in front of the Buddha. Luckily for me, in San Diego, they have a place called the Japanese Friendship Garden, and they have a giant Buddha statue that they just installed. So it was very easy to pray to the Buddha, to offer to them, and to get Buddha to bless the blade and awaken it, right? Now, the interesting thing about Thai magic is that they're not allowed to go to Buddhist temples. They're not allowed to participate because they deal with the unclean aspects of magic, right? And so using a tool like this, what is its use? What is its purpose? It's to separate the thread between the ghost and its body, right? So it can be used in a variety of different ways that allows you to cut not only the individual, but the spirit or the offending spirit out or off of them. So that it's a tool of exorcism, it's a tool of purification, it's a tool that functions in a different way than the dagger that I use to trap and contain entities, or the blade that I use to wield in 4 directions at once, right? And so by having these different relationships with the weapon, you, like the wand, can have multiples of them. You can have different ways that they attach to or interact with those things in your practice. So there was one that I wish that I still had that I don't. I was a kid, and it was a little dagger about yay big, back before you weren't allowed to take sharp, shiny objects to school. I was supplying the theater department with weapons so that they could use it in their stage production. Well, there was an accident on the stage, and our school was in the side of a church. And one of the kids got stabbed in his passive hand on the sanctified earth of the church, or what was an annex of the church. So it technically carried some really profane energy with there, right? And that was one of those things that got lost over the periods of time. So when you want to cultivate the relationship with the blade, you want to cleanse it ritually, you want to wash it down, making sure that it's dry if you're using water. If not, use an oil blend with the herbs mixed with the oil. Okay, the less oxygen that happens, or the less oils from your fingers that will rust the blade and corrode it, making it not usable, making it polluting the spirit of the weapon inside, is also very important in your use. The ways that you can do things when you're using them is, as you channel your chi, as you go through and you deal with these kinds of things, if you're going to be using a sword in combat, your body and your sword become one, and you can use it as an extension of your body. So projecting the energy out down your arm when you're holding the blade into the blade itself, and you can draw your fingers along in the sword mudra, 2 fingers up, down the blade, you with your passive hand. This is why you hold the blade with your primary hand in your right hand, right? At least for me. With the passive hand, I am drawing my energy through the blade as I go down. And so by doing that, it fills the blade with energy. And that allows you to hit harder. That allows you to cut sharper. That allows you to awaken it for that moment. Now, the more you can condition yourself to be able to do that during a series of strikes, of form, of patterns, of the way that you move the sword, etc., can become an invocation. So when you do that and you fill it up with energy and you awaken it, you then impregnate that blade with a spirit of your choosing, or an energy of your choosing. So that way it carries with it a significant advantage to you when you are wielding it in person-to-person combat. Now, what will this do if you're trying to do it against a person, right? You practice blades, okay? Watching you people, don't be evil. You can use the bamboo practice swords, a shinai or a boken, depending on which one you use. Like there's the wooden ones, and then there's the bamboo ones that they use for Kempo training. I've seen you can channel it down the bamboo in the same kind of way where you can practice with it. And if you get hit with it, instead of just leaving a regular welt, like this thing will leave you a blistering welt, like it fills up your thigh. Like I've done it to people. It's crazy. But that was back in high school when you go out and beat each other with sticks over the weekend. The conditioning of your chi, the more you get used to it, the more you get used to that drain on your body. Not only do you have to keep the blade in a precise form, right? Like with the Tai Chi or with the Kempo or with other forms of sword training, you can do that. And if you channel it into the blade using fencing foil or a saber foil or one of those kinds of things for competition, the more accurate you keep your hand gestures, the more control you have in your body, the more control you can project through the end of your weapon, right? And so that way, when it makes contact with your target, when it makes contact with the individual, you have those associations of this is the move that I need to make. This is the feeling that it needs to happen when it releases. And so you can control the release of that. And so you can release spells into your target when you cut them, when you make those attachments. Now, there is the crescent handle blade, which again, it's one of those that I'm not going to show on camera because of I've blooded it myself. Like I was sacrificing a potato to Eris, right? It's chaos magic. And I wound up slicing a giant half moon chunk out of my finger and had to get 7 stitches for it. This shit was not fun, but it's all pussy and gross for a while. But it bled the offering between Eris and the blade. And so that blade is always going to have associations with ritual magic, and it does get bitey. So watch your shit, guys. Like the white-handled knife that's only supposed to be for herbs, also sacrificed depending on which tradition you follow. The scythe is the sickle. Or you've got the black-handled knife, which is only for your ritual energy work. Right? And then you've got the sacrificial knife, depending on which tradition you follow. Again, that's been blessed and made pure enough to not corrupt the spirit, but to take the spirit and alleviate it and separate it from its body, much to the same way that this one does. Whereas when they do animal sacrifice and things like that, again, that's not something that I use. That's not something that I practice myself. So I'm not going to speak too much on that. I really don't recommend that path of practice unless it is your traditional background to do so, or you run a farm, in which case you're going to eat the animal after you give its spirit to your guardians or your patrons. So that's pretty much the lecture on the different kinds of weapons and the different applications of them in ritual use. You can use them to cut the pentagram that we talked about yesterday into the air. You can use them for anchoring specific watcher spirits around your circle. So because every blade carries with it the potential to have a spirit of its own, that spirit can then be elevated in the same way. Like if someone is victorious in a battle or in a combat or in conflict, the blade would be honored just as much because it was the thing that protected the physical body of the spirit, that protected and moved from the individual wielding it to the resolution of the situation. So because of that, it's something to be honored, it's something to be elevated, and it can become legendary, like the Muramasa and the there's 2 blades made by a blacksmith in Japan in the ancient days, and Murasami, I think it is, and the Muramasi. One of them would cut every leaf that, even if it wasn't around, the leaf would still be cut because of the presence that it had. And then there was one blade that would avoid cutting all of the leaves, like even the ones that would go around, like the leaves would move out of the way of this blade when it was put into a river with a bunch of leaves and different stuff, whereas the other one would attract to them and split everything, right? So you have the attracted or the repellent aspect depending on what the nature is of the individual who wields it. And so that becomes attached to the blade, the behavior of why it's picked up in the first place, what it's going to be useful for, what is going to be those next steps, so that the individual can assume possession or being shared possession. So if it's a sword that an individual used and it went through a battle and it's from history, right? So the think back to World War II and those conflict blades where people were stealing them from the Japanese soldiers, taking family heirlooms and things like that and bringing them stateside, right? Well, those blades, depending on which family and which tradition that they came from, were reverenced because the shared spirit between the name of the sword and the individual lineage of the one who carried it, their spirit gets transferred into that through a transmigration process, right? Like it becomes an extension of themselves. And so you can use it for evocation. So if you have the replicated blades of famous people in history, right? Like if you had the Roman swords, or if you had Achilles' sword, or these different types of things, during the rituals of high magic, if you're reenacting these kinds of traditions, you can evoke the spirit of the one who wielded it originally into the blade, right? Because you're calling it into an object, into a space that's not inside yourself. So this is why I don't say invoke. But during the ritual, you can pick it up after it's been consecrated, after it's been blessed, and you can get possessed temporarily while you hold the weapon with that spirit of Achilles, right? Or with, you can make it in arrows. It could be any weapon whatsoever. It can be, depending on like guns and things like that, different qualities because of the lead, because of the chemicals, because of the different aspects. But if it's a black powder weapon, it also carries vibration, especially if it was used in a gunfight, right? That takes a piece of the individual to fire it, the aim, the intent, the absorption into the material, etc. And so using your weapon as a means of defense for your ritual circle is a means to create space around you. Like everybody's seen things like Supernatural or Buffy or any of those movies where they're shooting rock salt ghosts and shit to make them scatter. Well, that's not entirely far off from what Taoist magic uses when it comes to like the invention, the creation of gunpowder. You can stick talismans and things like that at the end of a black powder pistol and fire it off and exercise the space. You can put gunpowder along a machete and you can light it off, and you can use a flaming machete to banish spirits and such, right? So it just, again, it goes into what is your use on those kinds of applications of it, and how literal are you going to get with it, right? If you need to do an exorcism of a flaming sword and you've got your sword coated in a flammable jelly, you light it on fire, you make your conjurations, and your sword is literally on fire, right? Don't burn your house down, kids. Don't. Those are for ritual applications of this stuff. And so as you think about your blades, as you think about going into the different layers and the nuance of, okay, well, is this a mass-produced piece of junk? This one, right? And I say that with the most love and reverence because this blade has been around with me for a while and it's seen some shit. But it doesn't have the same energy presence as the two that I use for exorcism the most. It doesn't have the same presence as the one that the Thai silver piece that's the furba with the four stakes on it, one to blade to pierce into each of the four worlds. So that way, when you deal with the dimensional outcome, you're dealing with all possibilities at once, right? And so the thing with the triangular blades is that they violate the Geneva Convention. So don't get caught with those out in public, right? Especially if it's a sharp blade that is specifically for creating wounds that don't or can't be sutured up because of just how much they shred. Like those are lethal wounds when you get stuck with one of those. So be very careful on what kind of message you're sending to the spirits when you start evoking them, when you start calling them out. If you're going to conjure up one of the generals in ancient Chinese magic, right? You want to make sure you have a sword that represents a station similar to one that they would carry, right? I've got a couple of one was blued blade that was used for executions, right? It was used to sever the head. It's a heavy piece. It's not meant for being carried in battle. It's a deep reverence. Like, this is meant to be a severity thing. This is not meant to be a light, fluffy, like, oh, I'm just going to cut a circle with it. It's like, no, there's some shit that's about to go down. This is going to be the blade to do. And so again, it just depends on what it is you're doing, how it is you condition the spirit within it. If you're doing the calligraphy on the blade in order to bless it or to imbue it with temporary magic, like with the inscriptions on the the Great Dipper wand, right? Or the sword of the Dipper, right? Each pattern carries within it a gate, an energy, a behavior, and you're eliciting that in the blade. Right? So you can engrave it, you can inscribe it, you can do it for temporary, or you can do it permanently, like the two etched blades like this one, or the Dipper one, right? Or you can leave them blank. Like this one has no inscriptions on it. I don't think I'll ever put any talismans on it. I'll just use it for cutting the space. But, you know, with the world degenerating the way that it is and war becoming an inevitable fact of everybody's life, we don't know what the future will hold. And so that's why if you consider which future you have with your ritual blades and your ritual magics and things like that, what is the significance of the thing that you carry, and can you use it? Can you use it fully? There's a line that says, don't train with any weapons, or don't carry any weapons that you don't know how to use, because it just endangers yourself, right? They say that it's not the world's first or even 10th greatest swordsman, it's the amateur that doesn't know what they're doing that you should be afraid of, right? It's like, if you know how to control the blade, if you know what actions to take, if you know which forms or moves will take down a single enemy versus a group of enemies, what happens if you're fighting a single individual is different than if you're fighting two individuals, if you're fighting three, if you're fighting five, if you're fighting 10. Those are all different techniques. Those are all different forms. Those are all different considerations that you have to have when you include a blade in your ritual practice. And so to be able to do that, and to be able to do that with clarity, to be able to do that with precision, so that your hand doesn't twist in the wrong kind of way to screw up your muscles and the chi flow and such like that, so that way you have the focus and the follow through, so that way your positioning and your chi stays balanced during the ritual action. And that's what's really great about using these as martial training for the energy work behind ritual magic, right? Which positions, which gestures, which form are you using it for, right? Now there's the wooden swords that I didn't talk about either, which is like the peachwood sword, Taoist sorcery that's used for exorcism, right? Peach being the immortal tree. And so when you channel the peachwood, you're calling on the spirits of the divine immortals. You're calling on them to come forth and act and to remove the evil before you, right? The peachwood can absorb it and banish it off, right? And then you have to stick there's a whole purification ritual for the peachwood sword too. It's quite beautiful, where you stick it in a bowl of rice, and then you've got your incense around it, and you let the evil drain into the rice, and you scatter it out, or you bury the rice, or you use it in ritual magic and such like that. So if you're going to be doing any puppets of cursing, you can stuff the rice that's absorbed the evil, so to speak, into a cursing puppet, or into a hexing puppet, or into a baneful puppet. Or you can use it as an offering to the baneful spirits, that they receive the energy, and it will enhance that kind of link between you and the yin spirits. But that link with the yin spirits, they want constant feeding. They constantly hunger. They constantly yearn for that which they don't have. And they don't have the higher spirit mentality, like if you were calling down one of the angels, right? The angels, yes, while used as tools of destruction by God and by the other people that worship God, the flaming sword, the destruction of Sodom, Gomorrah, and all of the other genocidal things that the Abrahamic religions are all known for, right? And so you have that aspect where, yes, the sword can protect, but its primary purpose is to cut down and kill. So it is a threat It is the thing that you incorporate into your ritual practice, which functions not just as the club or the release of the air spirit that we talked about with the wands, but it is the physical support to back up that threat of, well, if you don't do what I want with the wand in a nice even direction, then you will get cut. Then you will have that severity. Then you will have that fiery aspect of your will and the spirit. And so this is why I always associate blades with fire, right? And this is why I use fire when I heat up the blade to get the spirit of the blade moving in that direction. You don't want to use fire on the blade like I'm doing with the crest dagger, because it weakens the temper on it, right? Unless that's something that you don't care about, and in which case, go for it. But otherwise, if you're doing that to a really nice piece of metal, don't reheat it. Don't immerse it in water. Don't touch it. Just don't, because it'll fuck it up, right? And so again, that pretty much covers the higher aspects of dealing with blades and magic. I think I've covered everything. There's the naming, there's the purification, there's the spirit attachment, there's the ritual usage of it, the conduits of how they flow and form. The naming we did. I don't know. Am I missing anything, Mike? Is there anything else that you would want to?
Not that I'm aware of. You were on point with everything.
Okay.
I was going to yell at you about the naming, but then you went and covered it quick.
Yeah. The blades will earn their name, and if they don't,
don't be in a rush to get it named.
Exactly. Like if you don't touch it, like if it's a brand new blade right off the forge, right? Or if you're the first owner of it and it doesn't have a name, that's fine. It will go through experiences with you, right? And the have them all, it says, don't be more than a foot from any weapon at a time, right? Because you never know who your friends or your enemies are, or you never know what condition that you'll need your spear, your sword, or your dagger, or your knife, or whatever. And that gets misinterpreted a lot. You know, that's one of those things where people will carry weapons in their purse, they'll carry weapons on them. There's more guns per capita for private citizens than there are for like the military and all of that. It's ridiculous. And so you just have to remember to act right. You have to remember your behavior protocols. It's like, yeah, you might have a sword or a weapon or whatever on you, but that other person might be packing a 50 cal in their pocket, and you don't know, right? Damn hand cannons. You don't need to worry about that if you're not going to be a dick about your life. All right. If you don't do the shit that would make people want to shoot you, you're good. All right. So yeah, like names come, like the situational integrity also depends on what they go through. Like I had one of my knives stolen from me. It was the first one I purchased with my grandma when I was like 8 or 9. It was my first ritual blade. I used to take it to like the scout camps and shit. Like it was my first pocket knife. Had a jade handle on it, brass. It was beautiful. Then the fella that I was in a relationship with, like the reason why I knew I wanted to be with the guys is because of this kid. I waited 2 years for him to turn 18. And then, you know, he and I had a thing, but he wound up stealing it from me. And then he threatened to kill one of my friends with it. My friend knocked it out of his hand, took it back from him and said, all right, when you're ready to actually be serious, come get this from me. I found out about this story about 6 months after it happened when I saw my knife in his house. It's like, what the fuck is this doing here? Like, all right, it's on its own new journey now. Like it's now a weapon of conflict.
Right.
So all the magic that I was doing with it, carrying it, like I legit carried this thing for years. And when I put it down, when I said like, that's not the life that I want to, I don't want to have that energy attached to it, it found someone else to have that energy with.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll move on from you, and it's not a insignificant thing when that occurs. So they choose their own path, and if you're in alignment with the spirit of the weapon, it'll stay with you. It'll protect you. It'll defend you. If you're not in alignment with you, it will leave you. Be okay with it leaving you. Find a replacement. Find something new. It lived its journey. It has to go back to the other world or another place or what have you. And if it breaks in combat, the spirit is released. Don't resummon the same thing into the same blade. Make something new, right? Sometimes if you're doing energy work and you channel it through a blade and it strikes the surface and the blade shatters or the thing falls apart, which does happen. It does. The structural integrity, there could be a flaw that's being exerted on or pressure on the blade, or it gets bent because it was, you know, in a mock combat situation. This is why, even if it's a live blade, and by live blade meaning it's fully battle ready, full tang, razor sharp construction, you want to be aware of its use. You want to be aware of what happens when you interact with that against another weapon, even in a ritual combat, where you are replicating a battle, you are replicating a fight that occurred in history or an action that occurred in history, and you're recreating that in your ritual chamber in order to invite that energy through, in order to be able to pull that manifestation out. So that way, as you experience and explore what it means to be that soldier in that moment, you're recreating everything about that moment. The blade remembers, it gets possessed by the spirit of that energy. You become temporarily possessed by the spirit of that energy, and you can't let your vision go red. You can't lose yourself in combat to that moment, because if you do, it's the rift between the worlds that the weapon opens between the shedding of life of someone else and your own life as you become corrupted as the responsible party for that. So the entire experience becomes a violent, visceral thing. And that's one of those things where I'm going to go a little bit dark on this one. With my history is that there was a gentleman that used to tell me what he used to do to people when he was on the run from the US government down in Mexico for a dozen years. He would find tourists and he would take them into the jungles of Mexico. And specifically one temple that he found that's not on the register, that's in the jungles, that's down there. And he would quite literally cut them apart, doing the blood rites, doing human sacrifice, doing these kinds of things. And he was the most twisted fuck I've ever met. And the energy that would come off of him when he was talking about it was unlike any energy presence that I felt to date, because he was a murderer, because he intentionally sought to do that. He intentionally sought to drain them of their sexual fluids, drain them of their blood, drain them of their life in the most painful, visceral ways possible, and just going at it. And that was his thing. And that's what got him off. That's what he preferred to do. That's how he hungered. And that's the parasitic life that he became, right? Which is some of the most corrupt, vile shit I've ever had the unfortunate mispleasure of encountering. So in that case, he talked about all of the torture, all of the murder, and your weapon absorbs all of that. Your behavior, the reason why you would do a thing to somebody or to something, or to the capacity of pain and violence, that why becomes engraved within the spirit of why that blade becomes useful, or why that blade becomes the weapon that it becomes, with the lineage, with the stories, with the spirit that exists within it. And if the blade doesn't want to do a thing, don't find something else. And how do you know if a blade's not going to do a thing for you or with you or work in tandem with you? The energy presence, it's different, it's denser, it's unyielding. Whereas when things are in alignment with you, it flows evenly. The spirit is in harmony with your spirit, etc., etc. And new blades hot off the forges and things like that don't have that problem. I'm talking about hand down blades, like from one to the other, to the other, to the other. I'm talking about ritual magic pieces that, you know, an elder might produce for their younger students, right? So like if I ever got into blacksmithing and I made a bunch of swords for all the students, each one would find its way to the right person that based on the vibrations, based on the behavior of what it was, because it would be conditioned not just for that specific individual, but to enhance this particular quality, right? So it works in a couple of different ways, right? So it can either be made custom for you and aligned to you and your material and your energy and all of that, or it can be aligned to a general, this is what's going to happen. And it's like finding the right wand from Whirlwood, right? When you're at their wand event, you've got an entire table laid out of all of their offerings, and you can just feel the different energy currents coming off of each of the different pieces. Well, the same way goes with the weapon, right? If you're at the Red Fair here in San Diego or up in LA, right? There's I want to call it Angel Fire or Angel Blades or whatever. I forget the name of it, but they make battle ready combat weapons that they don't like to sell online. They only like to sell them in person because they want you to get the feel and the weight and find the right one for you. Right. And so that's what using a blade and incorporating it into magic, especially if it's a hand forged piece, it's gonna have a spirit of its own. It's gonna have its own applications, right? And the difference between a mace and a flail and a dagger and a sword and a short sword and all of those different things, you'll be drawn to different types of spirits within the weapons, and that's okay. Each one of them has a different function in ritual magic. Each one of them, if it's a tool to implement your will in a severe way, will function for that elemental fire. All right, it will get that will done. And that's what the blade represents, is what will get your will done, what will be the tool of your defense, what will be the tool that you use to feed yourself, knives and things like that, you know, common household wares. The axe is another one that you can use for that purpose, you know. So that really, I think, sums it up for and concludes what I have to say on all the weapons. I don't think there's anything left to say on that at this point, other than seek out one-of-a-kind pieces. Seek out, if you're going to have one, look for ones that are hand forged. Look for ones that are made for your specifications. Look for ones that you want to incorporate in your ritual work, right? And if you're going to be using stuff that's mass produced, places like Cold Steel, places like, no, I'd say just stick with Cold Steel because their stuff is really solid and doesn't break down. Paul Chen is really good as a knife maker. But, you know, fantasy blades, movie replicas and things like that, those aren't to be used in combat, but they are to be used for recreating scenes, recreating the experience of the emotional high or low of the thing where they were originally used. And so historical replicas. I know there's places out there that make like the replications of like Achilles' sword and things like that. You could go to Omega Artworks or Omega Works and get one custom. You could find a blacksmith local to you and you could get one custom. But that would be the route that I would recommend you take, especially if you're going to be using it in ritual purposes, is get something that nobody else has or has been very limited production, because it becomes its own individual thing. It's not just stamped out of a blank that a bunch of other things have been stamped out of, right? It's not sheet metal that's been banged into form, right? It's a piece of steel that's been worked for a purpose. Oh, that's one thing I want to say. If you're going to be making blades yourself, if you're going to hand forge them yourself, if you're going to temper the steel and such, using files or using pieces of iron and sharpening them yourself, intermixing them, creating the different layers and things like that, consider the origin points. Like you use a file to make a knife because it's the carbon high tempered steel and it's designed for metal, for that kind of thing. If you're using an antique piece, even though the blade gets forged out of a carpenter's tool, right? The craftsman that owned it before still has imbued its life and spirit into that. So even if it goes to the fire to be reforged, it still carries on the traits of its original use. So if it's a file that you're making into a weapon, or because they make files that are enormous, like you can make a sword out of a big piece of file that you got to use on a steel beam, but that's a tool of construction, right? It's a tool of artisanry, and so you should reflect in your skills with use of it that artisanal application. So you make it beautiful, you make it glorious, you do the motions, you do the movements that are proper to it, and you practice that, right? And so this is where martial training comes in, Tai Chi specifically, right? Like that's a really important part because it lets you connect your chi to the objects that you're using. So like there's little bits and pieces that it's like, okay, well, this is what they should be useful for. This is what you should be thinking about when you're looking for one. But just at the end of the day, don't be evil with what you conjure. Don't be evil with like trying to summon out the ghosts through the weapons that have seen war and conflict, right? You might not always want that in your life. You might not want that presence in what it is you get up to, as viable as it can be in certain cases.
Good rule of thumb would be to, if you're going to collect that many knives and such, write down on a separate book on what the knife is, what it's used for, and what it's endowed with.
Exactly. Having a book and a registry of your tools, right? It's the same way that you should have a registry of your spells and such. Your wands are the same thing. Each wand has a different personality. So each wand can have a different entry in your book as well.
You will accumulate a lot of books.
Yes. As per, like, get out of the way here. All of these back behind me. All of these and the stack that's down there. But this one has the knives in there. This one has the ritual tools in it. And knowing the names and the properties of what it is, it's like there's certain things I can show you the blade, but I'm not going to tell you the properties of it because I don't want you to screw with it, right? Because I don't want you. But there's also a linking spell that you can perform where you can exercise the spirit of one person's blade, weapon, or what have you, and pull it into the form of a different one, which is how I got the energy associated with that particular crest blade. Is a friend of mine had a weapon that they needed to disassemble, but the steel blade wouldn't release the vibrations of it, so I had to summon it into a separate vessel. So I used it as a containment spell on top of the magic that already existed within it. So it's a sponge, essentially. So that's why I keep it wrapped. That's why I keep the separate condition for that particular piece than the other ones, right? And then having them separated out is generally, but at the same time, they're all made out of metal. They're all made out of wood. They're all made out of not plastic. And that's the important thing. It's like if you're going to be using a tool that's got plastic on it, the metal is the only thing that contains the spirit. The plastic discharges it. So while things are fancy and fabulous and shiny looking and all of these different things, and you can use the blade, even if it's sharp or pointed, or the shape of it to do different functions in your magic, right? Like you can use the straight blade, you can use the razor thin blade, you can use the crest blade, you can use the saber blade. All of them function for a different purpose. Keeping to that purpose, right? Like if you're going to summon up a spirit of a knight who died, use a broadsword. If you're going to summon up a pirate, use a cutlass. Simple, right? Each one of them carries with it a different weight to the type of use that it had. So you connect with the type of spirit of the individual who had that. That's what it's for. So again, just be safe, guys. Just be safe. So I appreciate you joining us today. That ends the class on the blades for high magic. Have fun, my friends. Have fun. And try not to dull your blades by cutting the ground with it, right? Cut the space above the ground once it's been carved. Once, divide that area out. Use it as a wand, like you would a wand. Call out the spirit and send the spirit out to go do something. but try not to dull your blade, try not to touch your blade, and make sure that you ritually cleanse your stuff, because they do act as sponges for a lot of that vibration, and they will pick up on the behaviors of those that use them. So thank you for joining me for day 4. I look forward to this is pretty much the conclusion of the Tools of High Magic series, because really only you've got the pentacle, which we talked about, there's the cup that we talked about, there's the wand that we talked about, and the blade that we talked about. And so like with the tarot cards, each suit rolls a different aspect of life, right? You've got the pentacles, which were the symbols of coins or merchants. You've got the wand, which is the spirit of travel, of journeys, of the air, oratory stuff, you know, entertainers. You've got the soldiers that deal with the blades and the weapons and the defense and all of those things. You've got the cups, which are your reverie, your family, your conversations that are had with the spiritual purposes. It's through what you drink and consume. And so when with your tools and with the path that you walk on, just remember that these things go deep. So if you don't have all of the regalia right off the bat, that's perfectly fine. In fact, only having one of them for a year or 2 years is actually really good. So that way you learn the natures of it. So that way you learn the behaviors of it and how that behavior integrates with the practice that you have. And so when it comes time to add a cup to your altar, when it comes time to add a pentacle to your altar, or when it has time to integrate the wand and the practice of the daggers and all of these different things, to learn the skill to use them, to clean them, to maintain them, all of these different things. That's what you do when you build it for the Tools of High Magic. And that's why it becomes high magic, is because you are using it for a higher purpose than just the form that it was given. And so taking it and elevating it out of its form. It's not just a weapon of death. It's not just a weapon of war. It's not just a weapon that's been used for evil. It's something that can be used to protect, to help, to guide, to cut, to create. And in that creation, you have magic, you have the output, you have the resolution of your will. So thank you very much. And I will see you next time and for the next run of the series. Thank you so much, my friends.